Fellas, there are some fighters that have left the UFC to go to a different promotion, or they've simply just been super inactive, but they've then gone out and said that they want to return to the UFC, or it kind of makes sense for them to come back to the UFC. Maybe they've retired, maybe they've just fought in a different promotion, maybe they're just super inactive, but I'm going to be going through some ex-UFC stars who have kind of left the UFC or retired or just been super inactive, and some possible comeback fights that they could take if they were to return to the UFC. I'm not saying these fights should happen, but if they were to return to the UFC, these are the fights that I think make the most sense. And we'll start off with the first fighter, which is Donald Cerrone. And I'll start off with Donald Cerrone because he's gone out recently and said that he's got interest in fighting 2 more times in the UFC. He wants to come out of retirement and fight 2 more times. There's been a lot of mixed opinions on this. Some people think there's a lot of good matchups for Donald Cerrone and they wouldn't mind seeing him fight again. Some people think, listen mate, you're nearly 40 years old, pack it in, or you're past 40 years old now, pack it in, just stay retired. I know Dana White has no interest in seeing him fight again. My only issue with him returning is I swear he got absolutely juiced up on steroids the second he left the UFC. This dude went massive. He went from like a welterweight to a light heavyweight. This dude, he just injected himself with every steroid known to man, and the dude is huge now, so I don't know how he's going to get past the new drug testing agent in the UFC. But if Cerrone was to come back to the UFC, the first fight that I think makes the most sense would be Tony Ferguson. I feel like if you're going to put Donald Cerrone against someone, it has to make sense that you've got to get something out of it no matter who wins. And I feel like, again, this kind of makes a little bit of sense. I know Ferguson's on a massive losing streak, but Ferguson's most recent win was against Donald Cerrone himself. It was against Donald Cerrone himself, so I guess he's kind of got that whole thing that he's beaten him before. And I know Tony Ferguson kind of looks recently that he's incapable of harming a human being. His performances just keep getting worse and worse. And for the most part, you might be looking at him thinking that he should not be competing in the UFC. And I know he's on this massive losing streak, and he should probably just, or you should have retired like 3 fights ago. But you look at Donald Cerrone, I mean, this dude's not in the best position either. He's been out the octagon for 838 days. His last fight, I think it was UFC 276, all the way in like July of 2022. So he's been out for nearly 1,000 days. He's 41 years old. He's also been on a massive losing streak towards the end of his UFC career, just like Tony Ferguson. And he actually lost to Ferguson, which kicked off his losing streak. So I think this kind of makes sense. 2 guys that are on a losing streak, and at least you're getting something from this fight. You're either going to see Tony Ferguson get back in the winning column, which nobody really expected, or you're going to see Donald Cerrone come back to the UFC, beat a guy that he's beaten before, and again, get back in the winning column after being out for a couple of years. So I think Cerrone versus Ferguson 2 could possibly be a fight that makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of people are probably going to be picking Donald Cerrone to win this fight just because of how shit Tony Ferguson looked recently, but then when you take into account how long Cerrone's been out and the fact that he was also on a losing streak, it could be a low level, an extremely low level, but still a close fight. And if not for Tony Ferguson, I wouldn't mind seeing Donald Cerrone run it back with Nico Price. The first fight ended in a no contest. Nico Price has been looking terrible as well recently, man. The dude, ever since 2020, he's kind of just been looking terrible in every fight. He had a no contest against Donald Cerrone, and the dude just seems to be getting worse in every single one of his fights. He picked up a win against Alex Morono a couple of fights ago, but it was one of the worst fights I've seen in UFC history. And I honestly might not be against picking Donald Cerrone to win this fight. That might seem crazy considering that Nico Price is the younger guy. He's won more recently consistently. But I feel like Cerrone is definitely the better kickboxer out of him and Nico Price. And Price just looks terrible in every fight. His game plan, don't get me wrong, the dude is durable, but he just looks terrible in every single one of his performances. So I feel like if you're going to put Cerrone against someone, maybe put him against another, I guess, veteran with somebody like Nico Price. So that could be a comeback fight for Donald Cerrone. I've not got too much interest in seeing Cerrone fight again, but I feel like if you were to see him fight again, this could be a good fight. And then for Nate Diaz, I believe Nate Diaz will return to the UFC one day. I'm not saying he's going to go on like a title run or he's going to have a handful of fights, maybe just 1 or 2 more fights. The first fight that I would not mind seeing Nate Diaz come back to in the UFC is Jorge Masvidal. I know a lot of people are going to be bored of this matchup, but the last time they fought in the UFC, it was one of the best. I'm not going to say it was one of the best fights, but it was a great fight. Ended in a doctor stoppage, obviously, but the fight was just back and forth. Jorge Masvidal piecing up Nate Diaz on the feet. Nate Diaz was, just durable, walking forward, taking shots, eating shots. And even though they're not going to look as good as they were back then nowadays, it just from how good the first fight was, I feel like you can't really be against watching them go back in the octagon. You know it's going to be a good fight. You know what you're getting. 2 guys that are washed, but 2 guys that go out there and go on, put them in a scrap. And then they won against each other as well. Obviously, Jorge Masvidal won in the octagon. Nate Diaz recently beat him in boxing, so they've got the whole narrative that they're 1-1 against each other. And you might be thinking, looking at this fight, maybe, why would we not pick Masvidal again? How would this end differently to the first fight? But you look at them both. Masvidal's been out for 17 months. Nate Diaz has been out for 24 months. They've both been out for a long time. It's not like one of them has fought extremely recently. Masvidal lost his last fight to Gilbert Burns. Nate Diaz won his last fight against Tony Ferguson. I understand the opposition is completely different. And on top of that, you know that the build-up this time around is going to be way better than the build-up the first time around. Okay, maybe not in terms of they're more skilled now than they were back then, but You look at the build-up to the boxing fight, they were going at each other, they were fighting, they were scrapping. I'm not going to say it had a good build-up. In fact, the build-up was fucking terrible, but at least, there's some sort of animosity there towards each other. And the boxing fight weren't even that bad. It wasn't like one of these boxing fights where it's just obviously they're going out there and trying to get a cash grab. Maybe that was their intentions, but at least in the performance of the fight, it wasn't that bad of a boxing match. They both kind of brought it on each other, especially Nate Diaz. So I think Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal running it back in the UFC, I wouldn't mind seeing that. One more time, two veterans, the last fight, two guys that have fought before, the originators of the BMF belt. I wouldn't mind seeing Nate Diaz run it back with Masvidal. If not Masvidal, why not Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor number 3? I feel like this is a fight that no one talks about, and I don't really understand why. McGregor's already said that he wants to fight in the welterweight division. Diaz, obviously a welterweight himself. Seeing them both return against each other would not be a bad thing. I mean, they're 1-1 against each other. Obviously, Nate Diaz had an absolute scrap with McGregor the first time, got a massive upset, submitting him. The second time, again, an absolute scrap. McGregor won a close decision. So I feel like McGregor versus Nate Diaz number 2. It could be a fairly good fight. And I know you're probably thinking that, oh, McGregor's washed, the dude's on coke, the dude's not fit to be in an octagon with anyone these days. Listen, neither is Nate Diaz. The dude's 39 years old, and he's lost his past couple of fights. But to be fair to him, he has been facing the likes of Masvidal, Leon Edwards, and then he beats Tony Ferguson. And Conor McGregor's obviously not in the best position to fight, seeing how he is at these BKFC press conferences. But again, there's going to be a good build-up for this fight. They've been talking shit on Twitter for the past couple of years. The first 2 fights that they had a good build-up. I'm not saying, again, it's going to be the same as the first fight or the first 2 times around, but Diaz versus McGregor 3, a trilogy in the octagon, I'm not going to be against it. I don't really like the idea of these big stars returning against these up-and-coming prospects who don't really have, a lot of name value. If I'm going to see these legends return, I want to see them go out there and put in a performance that is going to be good against another legend or another respectable name, and I feel like that's kind of what we're doing with Diaz and Masvidal, or Diaz versus McGregor 3. And talking of Conor McGregor, some matchups that I would like to see Conor McGregor return to in the UFC when or if he does return. Like I just said, Nate Diaz, I've got a lot of interest in matchup, but another fight that has kind of been talked about a lot recently is Conor McGregor versus Dan Hooker. This fight, it's kind of just been brought up recently since McGregor's been booked against Oliveira. McGregor said that he's going to be facing Dan Hooker. I actually don't mind this matchup at all. Dan Hooker called out Conor McGregor like half the roster has after his win at UFC 305. Conor McGregor said he's going to be fighting Dan Hooker in February in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, I do not believe that for 1 second. McGregor said he's going to be fighting about 10 different opponents. Dana White said that it's a great fight as well, so it's something that Dana White would be down to do. McGregor versus Dan Hooker. I'm not even against this matchup. And again, you might be thinking that, Conor McGregor would completely run over Dan Hooker. You might be thinking that Dan Hooker's in a much better position than he is in Conor McGregor. You've got Dan Hooker, beats Claudio Puelles, goes out there, has a war with Jalin Turner, beats him, has a war with Mateus Gamrot, beats him. And I know he's also, before that, he was on a, bit of a losing streak, lost to Arnold Allen, lost to Makhachev, lost to Chandler, lost to Poirier. So you might be thinking, is he on the same level of Conor McGregor? But again, with Conor McGregor, this dude's been coked out of his mind. And even though he has lost his past couple of fights, and you might be looking at Dan Hooker as the better guy as of right now, McGregor's been losing to the likes of Khabib and Dustin Poirier. He ain't losing to bums. So I think Dan Hooker and Conor McGregor, it could be a good fight. No, it could be a good fight. This would be a good fight. I think the build-up would be interesting as well, and you just know that they're going to stand and trade. They're going to be throwing it all out there. It's probably not going to go the distance, and if it does, they're going to be full of blood, and they're going to be going out there and having an absolute scrap. So Conor McGregor versus Dan Hooker. I kind of feel bad for Michael Chandler if this fight happens, because Chandler's been waiting for the McGregor fight for so long, and he's beaten Dan Hooker. So for Dan Hooker to beat Gamrot and get the big fight with McGregor would be kind of, a stab in the back for Michael Chandler. But another fight I wouldn't mind seeing McGregor in is, like I just said, the Michael Chandler fight. I know Chandler's now booked against Charles Oliveira, but maybe the loser of that fight faces Conor McGregor. And I know a lot of people are kind of bored of the build-up between McGregor and Chandler. I feel like it kind of makes sense because they've had this entire rivalry on The Ultimate Fighter. They've been going at each other for the past 2 years. They've been talking on Twitter. They've had that, those altercations IRL. They've had their rivalry in The Ultimate Fighter. They've been booked to fight before. I feel like I've been waiting for this fight for so long that I just want to see how it ends. Even if this fight, ends into the abyss and it never happens, I'm always going to be intrigued to see how this fight would have gone down with McGregor and Chandler in 2024 or 2025. So Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, a fight that I'm not completely against. Then we've got Jorge Masvidal. Like I said before, Masvidal versus Diaz number 2 in the octagon for one last time. I wouldn't mind that matchup at all. But another matchup I think makes a lot of sense with Jorge Masvidal, both right now and a couple of years ago, would have been Masvidal versus Kevin Holland. I thought this was the correct fight to make after UFC 287, because leading up to fight week of UFC 287, where they both fought on the same card, Masvidal and Kevin Holland, they had a lot of altercations behind the scenes. They were trying to scrap each other behind the scenes. They were going at each other at the press conferences. They had, I guess you can say, beef with each other. So it would have made for a good build-up in a fight. They both had a lot of animosity towards each other. Kevin Holland ended up getting a knockout win on that card. Masvidal lost to Gilbert Burns on that card. Masvidal would have been fighting down. Holland would have been fighting up. It was the perfect time to make it. And then obviously, Jorge Masvidal decides to retire in Miami, and then obviously, like every fighter does, he decides to come out of retirement a few years later. But Masvidal versus Holland, even nowadays, I don't think this is a bad fight to make, because Jorge Masvidal, yes, he's on a big losing streak, and he's nowhere near as good as he was back in like 2019. He's losing to likes of Burns, Covington, and Usman, which are all, or at least when he fought them, were all top 5 welterweights in the world. Holland, you look at how he's been doing in the welterweight division recently. He's been beating Ponzinibbio and Chiesa, but he ended up losing to MVP pretty comfortably, and he got battered by well, he didn't get battered, but he lost to JDM, which is, I guess JDM is a top welterweight nowadays as well. But I feel like Masvidal versus Holland, good build-up. I'd probably favour Holland to win this fight, because, I mean, he is the more consistent fighter, and he has been looking better recently. But again, Masvidal versus Holland, another fight that I think would be a really fun fight, at least to watch from the feet. They ain't going to be grappling, they ain't going to be making it a boring fight. The build-up would be fun. It could be a potential comeback for Jorge Masvidal. It's going to be a step down from what Masvidal had in his last couple of fights in his UFC career. Then we've got Darren Till. I don't really know what Darren Till's doing for the rest of his career. The dude left the UFC. He's had a boxing match, but I just don't really know what his intentions are. He keeps talking on Twitter about how he just keeps shitting on all these UFC fighters, saying that he'd beat all these different fighters, but he never returns to the octagon. And like I said, he had a boxing match early this year against a complete no-name. Won the fight, but it didn't really mean anything because it wasn't a big fight. I feel like one potential fight for Darren Till to come back to could be Chris Weidman. Weidman versus Till kind of makes a bit of sense. I mean, I know that Darren Till's completely washed. The dude's been losing. Towards the end of his UFC career, he was just losing fight after fight after fight. But you look at the people he's losing to, it ain't complete bums. He lost to the champion Dricus du Plessis. He lost to the champion Tyron Woodley. He lost to one of the greatest welterweights of all time in Whittaker. And he lost to Masvidal in his prime and Derek Brunson when Brunson was then entered into a number 1 contender fight after that. So he wasn't losing to complete bums. And I feel like it's definitely a very winnable fight for Darren Till. I mean, Chris Weidman, the dude is, I mean, what is he, 3-7 in his last 10? He is the definition of washed. He's 40 years old. He got his legs snapped by Uriah Hall, and then in his next 2 fights, got battered by Brad Tavares and got a dodgy eye poke win over Bruno Silva. So he's not in the best position either, and I feel like there's no more winnable fight in the UFC for Darren Till that actually has some value than Chris Weidman. And you might be thinking, why are we doing this for Darren Till? What does he get out of it? Technically, Darren Till, I mean, he's getting a win over a former champion. Chris Weidman was once a big name in the middleweight division. I guess you can kind of call him a legend. It gets Darren Till back in the winning column. It gets him back on track in the UFC, and from there we can set up some more big fights if that's his plan. So I feel like Chris Weidman could be a big fight, and if he just wants to fight a complete no-name and get a free win, just give him somebody like Wally Alves. Wally Alves is another one of these kind of fighters that every time there's a guy who's on the come up, they kind of just feed Wally Alves to them. They did it to Abbas Magomedov, they did it to Ikram Aliskerov, they did it to Randy Brown, they did it to Nicolas Dalbe. Every time there's a fighter that you just want to give a free win, give him to Wally Alves. So I feel like that could be a free win for Darren Till to again get back on track. But those are some ex-UFC fighters and some comeback fights to the UFC that I would not mind seeing them in. So let me know your thoughts on these matchups, and if you have any interest in seeing any of these fighters return to the octagon, let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.